And I invite you to let me know your answer to this question. Who loves leftovers? Can I just see a show of hands? How many of you are leftover champions out there? Quite a few of you are. That's just really amazing. Because I really don't like leftovers. If it's up to me, I'd rather do away with these kinds of dishes in our refrigerator. In fact, it's interesting, ever since our last child, little Lori Beth Lessing, went away to college 3 years ago, my wife and I have had a difficult time fixing a meal for just the two of us that doesn't involve what? Leftovers. Leftovers. For over 20 years, we were used to feeding our family of 5. But now all 3 children have abandoned ship, leaving my wife, Lisa, and I with tons and tons of leftovers. In fact, if you would look at our refrigerator this morning, this is pretty much what it looks like. Not my favorite, but we've got a microwave, so we will, of course, eat leftovers. This is how I feel about leftovers. Leftovers are for underachievers. They really are. Most of you who raise your hand, you need to set your sights a little higher, don't you? Come on, think Cork and Cleaver, all right? At least think Subway or McDonald's, but don't think leftovers. You are an underachiever if you just have a microwave and a bunch of plastic dishes that you use to heat up leftovers. Who loves leftovers? Well, famous Amos the prophet sure does, right? We know that by now, only we're talking about leftovers being people, right? People who normally in society are shoved down a garbage disposal, ground up and thrown away. Those little people, those last people, those leftovers, Amos champions those people, doesn't he? So we're looking at the prophet Amos, all 9 chapters in this season of Lent, under the theme, Restore the Roar, right? Last week we looked at Amos chapter 1, verses 1 and 2, and of course chapter 1 begins with, among other things, the earthquake. Remember that? I feel the earth move under my feet so I can, in love and compassion, move toward leftovers. Amos is just getting started, though, right? We figured out last week that here's a map of Israel in the 8th century BC. Amos, of course, is from Tekoa. From Tekoa, just south of Jerusalem. And Amos is called to go where? You may remember from last week? Bethel. Bethel. Bethel, not the capital of the northern kingdom. That would be Samaria, but Bethel certainly is a strategic city in the north. And Amos goes there from Tekoa to Bethel to encourage people and challenge people to begin to love the leftovers. He begins in chapter 1, verse 3. With this very long sermon that we heard, kind of broken up in 3 parts this morning, right? For 3 sins and for 4, God says through Amos, He will not revoke His wrath and punishment against Damascus. Damascus. Remember what the people in Damascus did? They lined up people from Gilead, which would be just to the east of Syria and Damascus, and they took animals, they connected to animals, flint-studded pieces of wood, and these Gileadites who were laying on the ground, they had these animals essentially plow the backs and the bodies of these people from Gilead, right? Threshing them is what Amos says. Crushing them, impaling them, and skinning them alive. Well, then the people from Philistia and Phoenicia, they're called out because of their slave trade. Whole populations treating them like what? Crumbs, scraps, stuff you throw away. And then Amos says, the Edomites and the Ammonites. Oh, wow. What they did is they lined up pregnant women, and they killed the pregnant women with the slash of a sword, and in doing so, they also murdered the unborn child in the mother's womb. And then he goes on, for 3 sins and for 4, chapter 2, 1 through 3, the oracle against those Moabites. So if the Edomites and Ammonites destroyed the future, right, by killing unborn children, the Moabites destroyed the past. What did they do? This is sick stuff, right? They dug up the bones of an Edomite king, burned him to lime, and then used the lime to plaster their houses. That's sick. And then there's a 7th part to the sermon, right? For 3 sins and for 4, God will not revoke his wrath against Judah. Judah's accused of what in chapter 2, verses 4 and 5? Accused of breaking God's law and idolatry. Now, it's very important we understand that there are 7 parts to this sermon so far. So you can imagine Amos saying, please take out your bulletins and your message notes, okay? And people would assume that there would be 7 parts to the sermon, right? 7 is the complete number, the whole number. Already in Genesis chapter 1, there are what? 7 days of creation. Going all the way to the last book of the Bible, Revelation chapters 2 and 3, there are 7 churches in Asia Minor. So you are taking notes on this sermon, and you know that after the 7th point, Judah, it's going to be all over. These people listening to Amos from Tekoa preach in Bethel, in all likelihood, love this sermon, right? Because these people from Damascus and Ammon and Moab, Philistia, Phoenicia, especially Judah, these were public enemies number 1. These were people like Ohio State Buckeye fans. You need to understand, these are the enemies of our enemies. And so they were saying about Amos's sermon, wow, what an awesome preacher this Amos is. The mantra of the moment was, preach it, brother. Especially when Amos zinged the Judahites. The Judahites. We have been at war with these Judahites off and on for over 200 years. Ha ha! Good job, Amos. You jinxed those blasted Judahites. In fact, Amos, way to go. All those nations around us, they deserve it because they have taken people and shoved them down the garbage disposal and thrown them away. They've treated people like leftovers, but that's not us. Oh, no, that's not us. We're Israel. Again, 7 points, the sermon is over. So they thought. They thought, well, after the sermon, there will be a few announcements, maybe not too long, hopefully, Pastor Lessing, right? There will be probably the bell choir, not as good as our bell choir, but they'll probably do an anthem, they'll take an offering, a benediction, and then the normal coffee and donuts in the gym. But Amos wasn't done preaching. The lion of Amos 1 verse 2 was not done roaring. And you say, what is the literary convention he's using? You don't say that, but I'm hoping you do. It's called the rhetoric of entrapment. That's what Amos is doing. He's really putting a noose around Israel, and they don't even know it. Because there is an 8th part to this sermon, and it comes as a shocking surprise. from chapter 1:2 to 2:5. All these other nations are the chief of sinners, but certainly not Israel. And yet, the lion keeps roaring. For 3 sins of Israel and for 4, I will not revoke my wrath. And as I said, this came as a stunning and shocking surprise, because even Israel, even God's people, Israel, had taken the least, the lost, the last, indeed the leftovers, and shoved them down the garbage disposal. And so Amos says, these high and mighty women that we'll come back to momentarily on the upper left of the picture, adorned in all their splendor and their majesty and their costly jewelry, these women, along with their husbands, are trampling upon the bottom of that picture. The poor, the needy, the least, the leftovers. And so what is God going to do? Now watch this really closely. I'll do that one more time. This is as interactive as it gets this morning, folks, all right? What's God going to do? Well, in the bottom right, he's going to raise up the Neo-Assyrian army who will come in and destroy Israel and take Israel into captivity and exile. That's going to happen in 721 BC. Remember famous Amos about 762 BC. So in about 40 years, the Neo-Assyrian army is going to come. And what did the Neo-Assyrians do when they exiled whole populations? Well, one more time. What's up with that fish hook? I'll tell you what's up. Assyrian annals tell us that very frequently, when you were exiled by the Neo-Assyrians, they would take fish hooks and they would put those right in your nose. And then they would say, "Come with us." And you'd come with them, right? Because you've got a hook in your face. And you now are captive, and this is exactly what Amos chapter 4, verse 2 says. He says, you will be exiled with fish hooks in your nose. Why is that? Because the creme de la creme, the movers and shakers in Israel, had looked at the poor, the disenfranchised, the marginalized, and simply treated them like leftovers. How did they do that? Here come some of these women that Amos preaches against. For example, in chapter 4, verse 1. Hear this word, you cows of Bashan. Now, that's usually not a nice way to address females, isn't it? This is not a way to win friends and influence people by calling a bunch of women cows. But this is classic Amos. You women who oppress the poor, crush the needy. How do they do it? They don't do it with their own hands and feet. They are doing it insisting that their husbands make a killing in the marketplace so they can what? Keep having their extravagant parties. Bring us some drinks. He goes on. How else were they treating the little people like leftovers? Chapter 8. You need to understand this. The oppressing people in Israel were the people who actually showed up at church. These were not agnostic, atheist, pagan people. No, these were the fine, upstanding people in the community. But when they showed up at church, their minds were not on their God. What are their minds on? Amos says, hear this, you who trample the needy. Do away with the poor of the land, saying, listening to Pastor Lessing, When is this finally going to be over? Come on. I need to get back to work so I can continue to make a killing. It's not quite what they said, but in their Old Testament way, they said, when will the new moon be over? That would be a celebration in worship. That we may sell grain and the Sabbath be ended, that we may market wheat. It is, as I said, 762 BC, and Israel, this northern kingdom, had reached the height of its economic prosperity, the pinnacle of its territorial expansion. Due in large part to their king Jeroboam II, Israel was at the height of its existence. It was a time for those who had the means to eat, drink, and be merry. Building was on the rise. Business practices, though very corrupt, were making a few people very, very rich. Some even had the capacity to own two houses, a summer house and a winter house. Still others are not only making a killing in the marketplace, they are international investors in the ancient Near East. The popular thinking was, if the present age is silver, what is coming up is going to be gold. The day of the Lord will bring in unlimited prosperity. But Amos, who lived in this lifestyle, as we maintained last week, Amos knew that on the outside, it might have looked very prosperous, but on the inside, it was rotten to the core. Amos understands that there is an alliance between business people, politicians, religious people, and lawyers to take great advantage of the leftovers. Amos called it as he saw it. The nation was filled with power, politics, and phony religion. How did he know? Because he saw what was happening to the poor and the needy and the oppressed. Who loves leftovers? Let me get to that by telling you a poem that I've memorized. It goes like this. I don't keep my teachers trouble, and my grades have been okay. I do my chores at home. I'm in school every day. My parents think I'm average. My teachers think so too. I wish I didn't know that, because there's lots of things I'd love to do. I'd like to build a website. I've got a book that shows you how. I'd like to make the baseball team, but no use trying now. Because since I know I'm average, I'm just smart enough to see that there's nothing special I would ever expect of me. I'm just part of that majority, that bump part of the bell, who live their lives unnoticed in an average kind of hell. There's a lot of people out there, right? Living life unnoticed in an average kind of hell because they feel as though they don't belong. They are leftovers. This Lent at St. Michael, we're doing something about that, aren't we? We're just not listening to famous Amos. We are acting upon his mighty preaching. In fact, since last week, we have had people in this church who have taken this little brochure that you can get after church, along with the little card that you fill out anonymously, put it in the base of the lion there in our narthex, and start doing something about the leftovers. This is what people have done just in the last week. Blankets have been taken to the homeless shelter in Fort Wayne. Eyeglasses collected, sent to the Lions Club. That's a little ironic. We're all in the Lions Club, right? Famous Amos. You with me here? Okay, all right. But imagine that. We take eyeglasses and contact lenses for granted. Most people in a two-thirds world don't have that. So there's a group of this church that said, we're going to do something about that. Someone simply said, one of our older members of our church, I'm going to just send birthday cards. I'm going to send birthday cards to people at Lutheran Life Villages. Our 4G small group helped at Community Harvest Food Bank. Someone simply found out that someone was sick and fixed them a meal, and I'm told it wasn't a meal of leftovers. We're just getting started, aren't we? We are just getting started in restoring the roar of the Lion of Judah. But where do you find the momentum to do this, right? Where do you find the want to? Where do you find the encouragement to do something about it? The Bible tells us the answer to that too, doesn't it? On one Friday, the Roman soldiers took a leftover, right? Scratch that. That's not right. That's not correct, Reed Lessing. He's not a leftover. No, Jesus is the leftover, right? No one has ever been treated like this before. Oh, no. They marched him outside of Jerusalem to a place called Golgotha, where Rome intentionally maimed and mauled and systematically broke and bent and busted people. And this Jesus of ours was shoved down the garbage disposal, chewed up and thrown away. He was betrayed, whipped, spit upon, blindfolded, scourged, cursed, abandoned, spiked, and pierced. And he did it all for you. Because he would rather die than live without you. Talk about the bottom of the barrel. Talk about a leftover that doesn't fit. That would also be Reed Lessing. And this is just not pulpit rhetoric. I know myself. I know that my rebellion and my apathy and my indifference means that I don't belong. My stubbornness means that I should be left out. But miracle upon miracle, God loves leftovers. People who are messed up and will never get it right in this world. I was lost. And I've been found. I was blind, but I can now see. I was dead spiritually, but by the grace of God, I am alive. And what do we do? How do we live in light of this great, claiming, cleansing love? Well, so many. In Amos's day, and in our day, and in every day. Ignore the least, the last, and yes, the leftovers. We are different. We will clothe them. We will immunize them. We will house them. We will feed them. We will counsel them. We will hug them. We will hold them. We will baptize them. We will catechize them. We will absolve them. We want them to come to this altar where we can body them and bloody them. Because just like Amos and just like Jesus, we will always love leftovers. Amen.